It is a very, very long time ago that the gods created the human race, unleashed mortals upon the earth. And there are those who say, as a central tenet of their faiths, that humanity is the very pinnacle of divine creation. And there are those who hang their heads and say that actually humanity is little more than a plague upon the earth and might well have been something unleashed from Pandora's jar. And then there are others who find their experience of humanity is somewhat like the proverbial parson's egg, good in parts. Now, when the gods themselves had created that first wave of mortals, and different gods had been involved, Apollo had created some, Artemis had created some, Demeter had created some, Zeus himself had created some. Nearly all of the gods have been involved in contributing to the creation of that first wave of mortals in some shape, form or capacity. There were those worthy divines who looked down upon their creation and were justly proud to see the people they had put upon the earth and how they behaved. And there were those gods who looked down upon their creations and thought, is it really worth the effort if that's all they manage? And there were those gods who looked down upon their creations and were almost given to hang their heads in shame to see what some of them got up to. But things had not got quite that bad just yet. Upon the occasion when Zeus himself declared that a chosen few of the mortals would be invited up into the celestial realms to partake of a banquet, to sup at the feast tables of the gods. Now, one of these chosen fews to receive an invite delivered to him in green ink by an owl was King Tantalus. Now, King Tantalus, who had been granted a kingdom, granted land, the land of Sipylus, which these days forms part of Turkey, but back then was called Sipylus, overlooked by great mountains. He was a man whose blessings had come in the form of economic wisdom. Had banks existed in that day and age, he undoubtedly would have been the mightiest banker in the land, for he had a gift for taking large sums of money and turning them into gargantuan sums of money. And not only did he have a gift for making money for business and investment and so forth, but he also had a wonderful gift for spending money. And his own banquets, his own feasts that he threw down in the realm of mortals were fabled, were renowned for their extravagance, the wonderfulness of the food, the exoticness of the drinks, the amazing capacities of those people brought in to entertain, the singers, the musicians, the acrobats, the tellers of tales. They were the best of the best. And everyone was eager for an invite to the great feasting table of King Tantalus. And so when he himself received his own invite to attend the feasting table of Zeus, he wondered how much better the divine fare would be than the regal fare put on by kings such as himself. And maybe it was some intuition on his part, some acumen for business and for a good bargain and a good opportunity, but he thought to himself, perhaps it would be wise to go prepared. And so he did, and he turned up at the due time, on the due date, dressed in the most extravagant clothing that money could afford, and there were the invited guests from other parts of the mortal realm, and each was doing their best to put on a show worthy of a peacock. And the food and the drink was brought out, and music played, and stories were told, and acrobats cavorted, and wonderful entertainments were there for all to see, and all of it was so very much better than anything which even his seemingly bottomless coffers could afford down there on earth. The food, the drink, the ambrosia, the nectar, the very food of the gods was unlike anything you could imagine upon earth, and the taste, the best food you could eat upon earth, the food of the gods was 100 times better still. The best wine you could drink on earth, the wine of the gods, was so much better still. The most beautiful music you could hear played upon earth, the music played in the halls of Olympus was, well, beyond reckoning. And all of the guests, not least Tantalus himself, sat there open-mouthed and agog at the wonder of it, the beauty of it, the glory beyond measure of it. But, as I say, Tantalus had an eye for a chance, an eye for an opportunity. And whilst perhaps you and I, and indeed all of the other guests that were there partaking of that great divine feast, were just too awestruck to do much except ooh and ah and weep at the beauty of the music and be overwhelmed by the taste of the ambrosia, Tantalus had enough acumen to focus in on what he was doing and remember one of the preparations he had made. And that when he looked about and saw everyone was too enraptured listening to the storytellers or watching the acrobats and the other entertainments taking place in the great halls of Olympus, or too busy stuffing their faces, he reached into his robes and he drew out some of the small phials he had brought with him for just such a possibility, and taking his goblet he pretended to drink, and he just tipped just a little into a vial and slipped it back into his clothing. And he waited another little while, and seeing that no one had noticed his first purloining, there was a second, and then a third, and a fourth, and so on. Except merely because no one had jumped up and pointed the finger at him and denounced him for a thief. That doesn't mean no one had noticed. For Hermes himself has a certain proclivity for the light-fingered. Not only for the magpies of the air, but for the magpies amongst the human race, those who see something shiny and can't help but pocket it. And he knew a thief when he saw a thief. And when he clapped eyes upon Tantalus as he sat there trying to look innocent and oohing and ahhing and clapping and taking part in all of the proper audience responses to the entertainment, he knew that something was amiss. And the eyes of Hermes took in the cutlery and the china, and everything that should be there was still there. No knives or spoons or such like had gone missing. And of course, being a god, he had certain gifts, still has indeed certain gifts, and he could sense what was going on. But at length the banquet came to an end, and Tantalus made his way, along with all of the other guests, back down to the mortal realms. And it was then, when the last guest had gone, that Hermes confided in Zeus quite what he had seen in his mind's eye Tantalus getting up to, and Zeus was not best pleased. He was even less pleased when he cast his eye down upon the earth itself and saw that Tantalus was not simply having a quick secret snifter of the ambrosia in the days to come, but was inviting the great and the good and the august, the important and the, of course, self-important, to partake in mortal feasts in the mortal realms. But he was plying them with a sniff, a dribble, a drop, a mere soupçon upon their tongue of the ambrosia, edging it out, stretching it out, making sure there was enough for the next feast and the next feast. And of course people came from far and wide when rumour got round that they could taste, albeit only a drop or 2 drops, of the food of the gods, and what they would not do to get it. Tantalus went from being very, very rich to being obscenely, disgracefully, disgustingly rich, as everyone who could afford to do so sucked up to him in every way imaginable in order to get that dribble, that taster of the divine substance upon their lips. Zeus would have been annoyed enough, had he but been swigging it himself, that this, to tip the balance between gods and man, to decide, to take upon himself to decide, he, a mere mortal, a mere king, to decide who it is that should receive ambrosia, to rob the gods themselves of that decision, that power, was an affront. And so plans were made. And Zeus let it be known, through a dream received by one of his devoted priests in the kingdom of Sipylus, which was then conveyed to King Tantalus himself, that Zeus and the other gods should like the king to reciprocate. They had invited him to a feast. Was it not about time that he invited them to a feast? And of course there had been many other guests, and Tantalus asked around about these other guests. Had any of them also received via the auspices of their priests and priestesses such invites, invites, suggestions, requests, that Zeus and the Olympians go to their dining tables? And no. Perhaps in time they would be, perhaps. But so far, Tantalus was the only one. And even if, in the months and years to come, others were engaged to entertain the gods, Tantalus would always be able to say he was the first one to host the gods, the first one to be so requested. And of course, as the gods request, so it must be given. But, in the same dream this aged priest had, that Zeus wished to come to earth to sup at the table of Tantalus, so the priest also divined, it was not said outright, but an impression was left, an image was left, an intuition was left, that Zeus was unamused, that Zeus knew about the ambrosia and about the light-fingeredness. And this too, being a priest, he conveyed to his monarch. Tantalus was uncertain. Now, was this a genuine revelation from the priest, or had this pious, sanctimonious old fool simply heard the rumours going round that ambrosia was being shared with all of these foreign royals and dignitaries, and never with the old priest himself, of course, because he had no money to speak of. So why would he be invited to partake of the ambrosia? Was this merely this cantankerous old man wagging his finger and tut-tutting and disapproving and hinting, or did the gods genuinely know? And this is something that came to trouble Tantalus, and he discussed it at length with his son, with his wife, with his daughter, with the sages of the court, not the old priest of course, but with the sages of the court. Are the gods omniscient? Do they genuinely know everything? Or must they learn in much the same way that mortals learn, and just as you may be unaware what your next door neighbour is doing until you happen to come across knowledge of what he is doing, is it the way with gods? Do they know everything that mortals do the instant they do it, or must they trip across that knowledge? And there were some amongst the people who discussed this with who said, no, absolutely, gods are omniscient. I mean, what's the point of being a god if you're not omniscient, if you're not all-knowing, all-aware, all-seeing? You'd hardly be much of a god or a goddess if you were not that, surely, they said. And others said, well, no, if there were but one being in the world, one divine, that might know everything, but having so many gods, perhaps Demeter knows some things, maybe Selene knows others, and Hecate knows things again, and they all know different things. They don't all know everything simultaneously. Maybe if the gods up in Olympus all sit down and have committee meetings and pour their collective knowledge, then they would all become aware in due course of every single thing that's going on in the world, but they are not immediately, instantly all aware of every last little detail. Tantalus thought about it. He wanted to know, if if Zeus genuinely did know he had filched some ambrosia, was this invite to dinner merely a ruse to visit damnation upon him? But then he thought to himself, well, Zeus could do that at any time. I mean, if Zeus was that narked, could he not launch lightning bolts down from the sky there and then? Why would he need to come to dinner first? But what if this was a test, a trick to see if maybe Tantalus would confess all and beg forgiveness and return the tiny little dribble of ambrosia that was left in the last of the pilfered vials? Was it that? Or was this just the old priest having a bit of a harumph, and Zeus was none the wiser? And if Zeus was none the wiser, what a nightmarish and foolish thing it would be to confess to a misdeed which Zeus knew nothing about. I mean, would Zeus come down in good faith just wanting a nice slap-up meal, only to be confronted by some craven king wringing his hands and begging forgiveness? What then would happen? Everyone knew Zeus was not exactly the most calmly tempered of deities. Would he fly into a rage? Would he visit doom and damnation upon the kingdom that could otherwise have been avoided had nothing been said? It troubled him a great deal. And as the gods were not due to visit for 3 months, he had 3 turns of the moon in which to brood and stew and debate and banter and go over and over and over in his own mind quite what was going on. And maybe it is the case that he had gone a little bit strange with all of this brooding, and it had led to some rather odd ideas forming in the mind of King Tantalus. Or maybe I am being overly generous in such an assessment. Perhaps he was always a little strange. Whatever the case of it may be, those 3 months came and went, and of course they were spent very, very busily preparing the most extravagant feast imaginable. The best chefs that money could buy were brought in from left, right and centre, not only his existing kitchen staff, but people he had to pay a small fortune to bring in from far-flung parts of the world, and to bring with them foods the like of which had never been seen in the land of Sipylus before or heard of there. Food and drink and fruit and vegetables and meats and breads and grains, you name it, the most amazing and wondrous food was brought from all over, the most expensive food that money can buy, food that the king himself had never heard of but had been recommended to him by people from far-flung lands as worth serving to the gods, and who, let us face it, really knows quite what amongst human fare would appeal to a god. But the table was laid, it was decorated with gold and with silver and with jewel-encrusted goblets and plates and candelabra. It was a vision to be had. It was the sort of thing that only Lawrence Llewellyn-Bowen could have come up with on his most wild and fervid fever dream. And the food was brought out. But all of the while, the king was wondering, what do the gods know? What don't they know? And what are the point? Could he devise a test to find out what the gods do or don't know? If the gods knew he had stolen, surely he was damned already. And if you're going to be hung for a lamb, you may as well be hung for a sheep. And if the gods didn't know, and a test was put to them and they failed that test, why then would that not give free rein to the king himself? For he would jealously guard the knowledge of how limited the god's awareness was. He could go and do all manner of things that he'd secretly quite wanted to do, but always held back on for fear that the gods would know and disapprove and punish him accordingly. He could suddenly have the opportunity to indulge in his darkest, deepest passions for all manner of forbidden fruit. Still he brooded, still. And his son, Peplos, a fine young man, a handsome young man, a man of good character, seeing how troubled his father was becoming over the course of those 3 months, and having participated in many of these philosophical discussions, which usually over the course of quite a lot of wine, had become more and more heated, had begun to grow more and more worried about his father and his father's state of mind, and tried to reassure him, tried to put his own point of view about the all-knowing nature of the gods, and it would be best not to offend them. And of course, even though he'd never tasted any of this forbidden ambrosia himself, because it had been preserved for the great and good of far-flung lands, not for mere sons, he was aware, it was hard not to be aware, that his father had been getting up to all sorts of things with stolen goods from the halls of Olympus. He said, I know there's only this tiny dribble that you've got left, father, in a vial, but perhaps if you returned it to Zeus, presented it to him, apologised, promised him offerings and goods and all manner of way of making recompense, perhaps Zeus would forgive, and I think maybe that is indeed, I think, why he has come to dinner, because he wants to see if you will make atonement or not for your ill-judged decision. And the king was not used to being told by anyone that his decisions were ill-judged, let alone his own upstart son, who frankly should know better. And, well, the alcohol had been flowing quite heavily by that juncture. The feast was the very next day, and the palace was awash with coming and going and toing and froing, and questions from servants and staff. And was this all right? Was that all right? And, it was driving the king to the edge of sanity. The stress, the preparation, the worry as to what Zeus did know and did not know. And here was his upstart son giving it all that. And, well, they fell to blows. Well, I say blows, they fell to a blow in the singular. The father lashed out at son, hit him upside the head with the first object that came to hand. Did he intend to hit him as hard as he did? Or had alcohol lowered his judgment, his wisdom, made him act with more rage than he otherwise would have done had he been sober? Or was he truly so dark a soul that he had long harboured resentment of his fine, handsome son, and this argument had been the final straw that brought forth the poison within Tantalus' soul? Who can say? But there was Pelops, young Pelops, lying dead upon the floor, his brains leaking out upon the marble of the palace room. And long into the night, father stared at son, no doubt his mind whirling, sinking deeper and deeper into whatever feverish state it had been in to start with. And an idea came to him so repellent that some cankerous, twisted, gnarled, long suppressed part of him rejoiced at the very notion, cackled at the very notion, and did it. In the darkest hours of the night, when his wife was abed, his daughter was abed, practically all of the palace servants, aside from those in the kitchens toiling away, were abed, he dragged the inert body of his dead son, dragged poor Pelops down into the kitchens, into the section of the kitchens, for palatial kitchens were enormous. There was a bread section and a vegetable section, and a section where they made soup, and a section where they made cakes. It was, well, practically a palace of kitchens inside the palace of the king. He dragged the body to that part of the palace kitchens where meat was prepared, to the butchery section. And there he found the chief butcher, early hours of the morning, matchsticks propping open his eyelids to keep going, preparing the last few morsels for the great feast the next day. He found this fat, sweaty butcher preparing the last of his dishes. And the butcher looked in mortification at the sight of the king dragging the lifeless body of his own son into the butchery area. And the king said to this butcher, "Here is meat. Bake a pie, cook a stew, spit a roast, do something with it, serve it as the chief, central first dish of the first course that is to go before the gods upon the morrow." And the cook begged and pleaded and tore at his hair, and the king said, "If you do not serve this meat, I will serve your meat. Do it, on pain of your own death. If you do it, you will be well rewarded and need never work in these kitchens again. You will have your own villa, your own lands. You will have your own team of servants to cook for you, far away from here. But if you don't do it, there will be 2 pies tomorrow upon the great feasting table." And with that, the king turned tail, went back to his bedroom, and passed the remaining hours of the night as best he could. And that butcher, quaking, shaking, terrified for his own fate, for he had a wife, he had children, and if he were butchered, would the king have them butchered too? Who could say? The man clearly had gone mad, but he did what he was ordered to do. He cooked Prince Pelops. And as per the king's orders, he made it known to the head waiters that that very first course, when the gods arrived, would have an addition. And this addition was meant to be the chief dish, the central dish, placed highest above on the tiered stands that bedecked the great feasting tables in the king's hall. It was to be placed there. And when the dish was finished and prepared, the butcher fled the kitchens, fled the palace, went home, got his wife, got his children, packed their bags and legged it as far away as they could manage. The gods, with a great fanfare resounding around them as they descended from the heavens in a great swirl of mists, came to earth. 12 of them, magnificently dressed, tall, grand, glowing, radiant with light, taking shapes and forms, because to look upon the gods themselves in their true form would have reduced everyone to a pile of ash. So they took upon shapes inspired by the statues of them in the great temple that the old priest who had had the dream from Zeus tended. And the old priest, who was amongst the crowd welcoming the gods in, saw what seemed to be his statues in the temple coming to life. Oh, and he wept for joy. It was the most sublime moment of his long ancient life to see the gods made manifest, to walk past him, to smile at him, to acknowledge him for his devotions for all of those years. And even though he had not been invited to the banquet because the king had not considered him important enough, this brief meeting with the 12 Olympians was enough to make this life and his next 12 lives worth living. They walked through the land. People came in their tens of thousands to catch a glimpse, about the briefest glimpse, of the gods as they walked from the temple where they had descended to the great feasting hall of King Tantalus. They sat at the great table there, surrounded not only by the king's family, but by all manner of invited guests from miles and miles around, the great, the good, the grand, the self-important, all of the worthies, none of whom had been invited to participate in the great feast in Olympus, but who Tantalus wanted to invite to participate in this great feast. There they sat, and, well, to sit at table with a god, most people were incoherent, babbling, or stunned into silence, overawed, not knowing what to say. But the food was brought, dish upon dish upon dish, ewer upon ewer upon ewer, of wines and meads and all manner of things to serve before the gods. The music began to play, jugglers juggled, acrobats leapt and twisted and turned as the entertainments took place, and there came the dish suprême, a great roast meat upon an enormous gold platter, that took 6 big lads to carry it to table and place it upon the highest of the podiums that were set about the table as the food was staggered up in layers and tiers. And it was cut by the head waiter, sliced and served to Apollon, to Hephaestus, to Artemis, to Demeter, to Zeus, to each of the 12 gods and goddesses. The food was placed upon dishes before them. A great toast was made, blessings were made, speeches of welcome were made. And the gods, 11 of them, sat down at the end of the speech making to dine. 11 of them, because the 12th, Demeter herself, her mind on other things, upon the turning of the seasons, upon the passage of the earth, had absent-mindedly sat down a little bit early, when there'd been a pause in one of the speeches, thinking the speech was over, not really paying attention to it, not listening to the wittering of kings, because the wittering of kings is as dull then as it tends to be these days, and had absent-mindedly started chewing the meat upon the plate before her, whilst her mind was elsewhere upon goddessly matters. But as Zeus picked up the meat, ready to place to his lips, he smelled the aroma and dropped the knife that held the meat. He roared, he thundered, the hall shook. Demeter stopped eating, for even that made Demeter's mind come slapping back to attention and off of the things that she had been daydreaming about. To see the wrath of Zeus, to see the tapestries fall from the walls, the ornaments and the ewers fall off their shelves and shatter, the servants to scream and run hither and yon, the ewers of wine and mead to tip over, the food to roll off its various different platters. The gods knew in the instant that Zeus began to roar of what he was roaring. For Zeus recognised the aroma of human meat, of human flesh, knew that they were being served a cannibal's feast, and knew in the instant, the way only the king of the gods may do, precisely whose flesh it was upon his knife. And that Tantalus had not only tried to put a cannibal dish before them, but had murdered his own son, spilt his own blood, ended his own line, male line at least, for he had daughters who were still alive. The fury of Zeus was not to be abated. The palace was left in ruins. The king and his line were cursed and damned for all eternity, and many and various other ways in which that curse manifested in the coming years. But Tantalus himself, struck with terror, horrified, besides himself, looking upon the face of his wife when she realised what that great meat roast upon the gold platter was, looking upon the face of his daughters, who were horrified to know what had become of their brother. Perhaps then reality pierced his madness. It certainly pierced his heart, for he fell down dead there and then upon the spot. And his soul flew not up, but down. Down, down, deep, deep down, into the pits of Tartarus itself. And there it languished, and there it languishes still. And when, many centuries later, Odysseus was undergoing his own journeys into the realms of Tartarus, he came across the haggard, withered spirit of King Tantalus, who had once been quite possibly the richest man upon earth, now dressed in rags and looking like a beggar, a tramp, chained up and forced to stand up to his neck in a great lake. A lake not of water, but a lake of the finest wine. For Odysseus was able to smell the lake itself, and it was a fine vintage, and he even scooped a handful and tasted it and knew what a fine vintage it was. And Tantalus looked at him with crazed and bittered eyes to watch him sip the waters of the lake in which he stood. His lips parched and dry and cracked, his face as dehydrated and haggard as a man crawling on hands and knees through a burning desert. And even as Odysseus watched, that tormented soul leant down ahead to drink of the waters, and the waters drained away. The wine was gone, as if it had never been. And above him, on the banks of the lake, with great long branches dangling over, just inches from the head of Tantalus, there were pear trees and fig trees and pomegranate trees, there fruit of every which way and persuasion. Succulent looking fruit, wonderful looking fruit. Some of it was close enough to Odysseus for him to pluck from the branches and eat it himself, and it tasted glorious. But when that mad-eyed, haggard, emaciated king, who had been a big man in life, was now but skin and bones, reached up a manacled arm to pluck some fruit from the nearest branch, the trees lifted their branches up far, far out of arm's reach. And Odysseus understood that this had been so since the very moment in which Tantalus had arrived in Tartarus. This had been his punishment, day after day after day, for century upon century upon century, to be tormented forever by succulent wine that he cannot drink, and must forever be in a state of thirst that never quite kills him, and to be within sniffing distance of the most succulent and wonderful food that he can never quite eat, but must forever starve, but not quite enough for it to kill him. And Odysseus realised that this would go on and on and on for centuries to come, perhaps millennia to come. Who knows when the judgment of Zeus might relent and let Tartarus out of his torment, let Tantalus out of his torment in Tartarus. Maybe it never will. Maybe he will be there for an eternity, or maybe one day some forgiveness may be given to the old king, and he may be released. And he is there still, for all that I know. But you may ask, what of his poor son? What of old Pelops, or young Pelops? What became of him? Did he receive some reward in the afterlife for having been so horribly murdered and cooked and partly eaten by the gods at the feast? Well, Zeus, when his rage subsided and the palace was left devastated, looked to the great gold dish with almost the whole remains of Pelops upon it, and worked a miracle, worked an act of such magic that the flesh uncooked itself, that the sliced up pieces adhered to each other once again, and that beautiful, handsome, charming, gentle young man was restored to full life, or at least almost to full life, for the portion of meat that Demeter had in her absent-minded state been chewing upon, what had been digested by a goddess could not be undigested by the goddess. And so Pelops, in his resurrected state, had a great hole where his shoulder used to be, and very painful it was. And so the gods, the master craftsman Hephaestus himself, following the instructions of Zeus, created an artificial shoulder out of ivory, as pale as the young prince himself was, and adhered it into place and sealed the wound such that Pelops' arm could move and rotate and do all the things an arm normally does, and he was restored and remained restored until his eventual death many, many years later, after a good and happy life. For although the bloodline of Tantalus was cursed. Pelops, as the innocent victim of his own father's rage, was not.